Hi everybody, Pastor McGuire here, and do I have a special treat for you? We're going to call this a special bonus episode in our Gospel of Mark series. In it, you're going to watch a conversation I had the privilege of having earlier this week with one of the leading living experts on the Gospel of Mark, Dr. James Voelz. Now, Dr. Voelz, he was one of my professors at the seminary, and there are few people better qualified to lead us through the Gospel of Mark than he. And in this conversation, we're going to hear everything from what about the Gospel of Mark makes it so interesting and compelling to him as a New Testament scholar. And we're going to talk about the linguistic features of the Gospel of Mark, why the ending of the original manuscript is most likely at verse 8 in chapter 16, where all we're told is that the women went away afraid, for they were afraid. How can that possibly be the last words of the Gospel of Mark? And then all kinds of other things. The message of Mark, the particular artistic features of the Gospel, and then he's even going to, toward the end, bring out some points having to do with Jesus' healing of the Gerasene or the Gergesene demoniac in chapter 5. Before we roll tape, let me tell you a few things about Dr. Voelz. Dr. Voelz holds the Jack Dean Kingsbury Chair of Exegetical Theology at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, Missouri, where he has been on the faculty since 1989. And for about 10 years before that, a little more than that, he was a professor at Fort Wayne at the Concordia Theological Seminary there. His areas of focus are the Greek language, having written and published a fundamental Greek grammar for learning the Greek of the New Testament. That is now in its third or fourth edition. Also hermeneutics, that has to do with the theory of interpretation, the principles one applies when interpreting the biblical text. And the book on that subject he's published under the title, What Does This Mean? Good Lutheran title. And then, of course, the Gospel of Mark, on which he has published now a 2-volume commentary. And we'll talk about that quite a bit in the conversation. He is a member of the International Society of New Testament Studies, for which he regularly presents papers and co-chairs seminars. He is involved with the Society of Biblical Literature, has been since 1977, where he also regularly presents papers on a wide range of topics, including the Greek language and hermeneutics. He holds a PhD in New Testament Studies from Cambridge University in Cambridge, England. He received his Master's of Divinity from Concordia Seminary in St. Louis. And in addition, he is an avid sports fan and sportsman himself. He plays tennis. He coached and coaches the basketball team at the seminary, the tennis team, the soccer team at seminary. He also plays golf and is a tournament bridge player. So a real Renaissance man, Dr. Voelz. Right now, he is residing in Fort Wayne, Indiana, with his wife, Judy. They have a son, Jonathan. And I just want to say that Dr. Voelz is one of my favorite professors. He was truly a student's kind of teacher, cared deeply about the students he taught, both in class and out of class, and was one of the more visible professors, made a point to come to the social events, the Oktoberfest, interact with the students between sessions at symposia, that kind of thing. He was an encourager, a gentle corrector, but above all, he brought to every subject he taught this infectious enthusiasm, especially for the study of God's Word, and I know those qualities are going to come through in the conversation you're about to watch. One last note before we start it, and that is to say that there were some audio glitches at points. You never lost more than a couple of words here and there spread out over the course of what turns out to be about an hour's conversation. But to help you in those places, I've gone in and closed captioned those few words so that you get an idea of what he's saying, but you never miss the larger point, thank goodness. And at about minute 20, I just figured, oh, I'm going to closed caption the whole rest of this thing, even though it proved not to be that necessary, because the audio really does get better as the conversation goes on. So with that in mind, I turn things over to myself and Dr. Voelz from earlier this week. Good morning, Dr. Voelz. It's a real thrill to have you today.
Oh, it's fantastic. Now that we got Zoom going, this is great.
Yeah. How's quarantine treating you, by the way?
Well, I hate to say it, but I routinely disobey it because, and I'll tell you why, because it's a matter of actually watching what officialdom does, not what they say. So I'm taking as my clue Dr. Deborah Birx, who shows up every day on these briefings, okay?
Right.
Now, Dr. Birx does not wear a mask. When she is not speaking, she's standing in a line with other people, and they're closer than 6 feet apart. And I imagine she is not living at the White House. So that means now she doesn't wear a mask, she doesn't distance, and she doesn't stay quarantined. Well, if she doesn't feel she has to do all that, tell me why I have to.
That's right. That's right. Well, I won't turn you in.
Okay, that's good. That's good.
I wanted to start with the fact that you've written a 2-volume commentary on the Gospel of Mark that numbers over 1,200 pages. This has been a passion for you for several decades now. What is it about the Gospel of Mark that has sustained your commitment to studying it, writing about it, teaching it for so long?
Yeah, that is a tremendous question. It all started at the seminary my second year when I had Edgar Krentz as a professor. He was part of the walkout faculty that joined and did Seminex, okay? But he was a very good prof. And I had him for the Gospel of Mark. And just the detail with which he went at it started to really fascinate me. And it was in that class that and you and I last night, as we were setting this up, were discussing this. And that is, I came to the conclusion that Jesus is the Elijah to his own second coming because of the way Mark is set out. And I thought, listen, if this can be that literarily sophisticated, this might really be worth looking at as the gospel. Well, then, that was kind of on a back seat for a while. And when I joined the International New Testament Society, SNTS, all of a sudden, Mark became a very celebrated book. Why? Because people started looking at it from a purely literary point of view. What was happening is the historical critical method was coming into more and more question. Mm-hmm. And people were saying, you don't read holistically with the historical critical method. Mm-hmm. You read atomistically. Well, people started to read holistically, and Mark was a kind of a good candidate for this, for the New Testament, okay? And so narrative criticism, which began, in the 50s and 60s in English faculty, started to make its way into New Testament studies. And then that moved to reader response criticism. You started to say, how do I interact with the text? And Mark is perfect for this. So as you know from your seminary, from having me, I'm really, really interested in hermeneutics. So there came to be a kind of a wedding of interest in the Gospel of Mark with interest in hermeneutical issues such as reader response, how do we interpret, and so on.
Right, levels of
Then,
meaning.
so as I got going on that, then the whole grammar thing, which I'm always interested in, my first book is basically grammar,
Right.
is I started to see, when you work on Mark by itself and aren't it's amazing. So I would have to say from the fact that it itself is literally such a genius work that grammatically it's got a lot to look at and so on. And if you just let me talk, I got more to say on this.
Yeah.
Is that all right?
Oh, that's great. No, this is great.
Yeah. Well, what I wanted to say is this. You have to decide very early on whether you think Mark is essentially an early and crude take on writing the gospel,
right,
or whether it is a sophisticated literary piece. I mean, you just kind of have to decide this.
right.
And I'm Brent, I'm going to put it like this. The longer I worked on Mark, I'm going to put this kind of almost romantically, okay? The longer I've worked on Mark, the more I am convinced that I am in the presence that it's not essentially a guy cobbling together traditions and stuff like that. It is a guy doing very sophisticated composition. And I have to say, that's what makes my commentary different than any other commentary on the market. I mean, I think that it respects the textual degree that no one else does, figuring that I am the presence of someone from Shakespeare, we actually work on all aspects.
Right. Would you say that it's still the prevailing view that Mark is early, Mark is simple, Mark is primitive, literarily?
Yes.
And
that
therefore,
is,
those are the presuppositions going in. People aren't really going to spend the time that you've spent on reading it as a serious, sophisticated text.
See, that is well put, because that is precisely the point. Even the people who don't think it's sophisticated literarily, and there are people who view it as a literary piece, they still view it as early and kind of linguistically crude.
Right.
So, for example, if I were to say to this, and I'd bet big money on the following statement. I could say to any New Testament scholar, how many times does the classical form "ephe," he said, how many times does that occur in Mark, and where does it occur the first time? Well, nobody would know the answer to that question. See, it occurs the first time in Mark 9:12, and it only occurs in the last half of the gospel. See, now this is an amazing thing, actually, but people sort of don't. I don't know, what would you say? Don't care about that.
Yeah.
It doesn't strike them that you ought to be struck by Mark's linguistic usage.
Yeah, and let's talk about that. What are some of the linguistic features of Mark that make Mark recognizable as Mark as opposed to Matthew or Luke or John?
Okay, good. Well, one of the big things is that, and I have to tell you, Brent, what I'm going to say next is absolutely the case. No one else has ever discovered what I'm going to tell you next, and that is the linguistic profile changes from the first half of the gospel to the second half of the gospel.
Yeah.
So in the first half of the gospel, you have very definite characteristics that are pervasive. Okay, the basic is all there is verb precedes the subject. That's VS word order. Okay.
Right.
Many sentences do not have an explicit subject. The subject will simply be he. And if Jesus is talking, let's say, to the Pharisees, it'll simply say, he said, they said, he said, they said. You won't find the nouns Jesus and the Pharisees in there very much. Okay.
Right.
So I'll just take those three features. Okay. Those are pervasive in the first half of the gospel. All of a sudden, you start to get to about chapter 5 or 6, and if you're paying attention, you suddenly start to say, hey, wait a minute, we're seeing more subject-verb word order now.
Right.
I'm seeing more use of de rather than kai as the conjunction. I'm seeing more explicit subjects. Then when you get to the last half of the gospel, and you're in chapter 15, Jesus talking to Pontius Pilate, every sentence has an explicit subject. It's almost always de and not kai.
Yeah.
It is largely subject, verb, word order, not verb, subject. It's like you got a different guy.
Yeah.
What he's done is he has transitioned, and here's the payoff of this. He has transitioned from a subject style of writing, generally and is transitioned to a more Hellenic or Greeky Greek style of writing as Jesus comes to the sophisticated metropolis of Jerusalem. So in other words, Mark's Greek actually reflects the socio-cultural geographical setting of where Jesus is. As he comes to Jerusalem, the Greek changes.
Oh, okay. All right. Because I would think to the lay person that they would expect the order to be reversed. That in the much of the first part of the gospel, Jesus is moving around in Gentile areas. Is that fair to say?
He's moving around in Galilee and makes a few forays into Gentile areas.
Yeah, like the Gergesene demoniac episode.
Yeah, or the
Syrophoenician woman.
You know, but
otherwise,
those are
he's interacting with Semitic culture.
Yeah.
But in Jerusalem, the cosmopolitan city, the Romans are there. Greek culture is held in high esteem. Now, all of a sudden, the language is Hellenic.
That's right. And do you know where the big exception is? This is what's the thrilling one. There's a big exception in chapter 6 at the death of John the Baptist.
Oh, right.
Because they're in the Hellenic court of Herod Antipas.
Yeah.
Herod Antipas was educated in Rome. He was a sophisticated Greco-Roman ruler. The Greeks are different in that pericope.
Wow. Wow. So in the middle of the Semitic section,
Yeah,
all of a sudden we've got this Hellenic
yeah,
piece
that's
that
right. That's
reflects
right.
a Hellenic story.
That's right. That's right.
Wow. Wow. Oh,
Now,
that's amazing.
well, now, here's the interesting thing, though, and I want to, for the people who are watching this, I want them to be clear. It's a kind of a sea change, okay? It's like when you watch the tide coming in. Not every roll of the tide goes further up the beach,
Right.
but if you watch it, it slowly comes, and that's what it's like. So
Yeah.
when I was reading, I mean, believe it or not, Brent, this is actually the case. So when I was working on the gospel, I'd get to chapter 4, and all of a sudden I'd say, "Oh, this pericope has two uses of death, not one." That's really interesting. See, and there'd just be these kind of little indications like this. Then by the time you're in 7 and 8, you're starting to make the change when you get Jesus in before Pilate. It is a such a different Greek. In fact, let me just tell you, because we don't have time to do it today, but I want you to look at the contrast. So take this down for yourself.
All
Look
right.
at the contrast between the Greek of Mark 3, 1 to 6, and Mark 15. Let me give you the exact verses. I think it's 3 to 9, the scene before Pontius Pilate. And I just want you to compare. It's quite 2 to 15. Well, or start with 6 to 15.
All right.
You compare. It's astonishing what the difference is. And I have done this in national and international conferences, is I lay those two pericopes out and I say, it's not the same kind of Greek. And there
Right.
isn't one person I have met yet who's ever noticed that.
Incredible. Incredible. So I noticed with, so Mark 3, 1 to 6, withered hand, the
Yeah.
healing on the Sabbath. I see a lot of Kais. I mean, just
Yes.
skimming, and I'm guessing in 15 we're going to see a lot of Des.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then also what you're going to see in 3, 1 to 6, you're going to see a real lack of explicit subjects. It'd be he said, they said,
Yeah,
he
yeah.
said. And this is disguised in the NIV because they will
Supply the subject.
This is, they'll put Jesus in all of a sudden.
Yeah. And it's not
Jesus
there.
said to them. Yeah, exactly right. And now another thing, though, is this. Oh, let me say one other thing. When you get to 16, 1 to 8, resurrection scene, okay?
Yeah.
The theme at the end of that is he is going before you into Galilee. There you see him just as he told you, okay?
Right.
In 16, 1 to 8, the Greek is back to the first half of the book.
No. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. It's like me starting over again.
Exactly.
Oh,
exactly.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah. It's quite remarkable. In fact, I think there's only one debt in 8 verses. Right.
I'll be. Okay. Well, you want to talk about that? I mean, that's a very big issue with the Gospel of Mark, where it ends. And the class, their Bibles say above verse 9 that the earliest manuscripts only go to verse 8. What about that?
Well, this is there are two issues. One is the let's say the external evidence for where the thing ends. The other thing is the literary issue of what do you do if you have this sort of suspended ending at 16:8 ending. They were afraid,
Yeah.
and that's kind of it. the story is different if it ends there than if you tag on the rest of this stuff.
Right.
Now, I'm going to answer your question in two parts. First, I'm going to talk about the extra evidence and so on, but then I want to talk about what it does to the story, and then we can use that, I think, to transition to marking themes and so on like that.
Great.
All right? Good. All right. So as far as 16:8 is concerned and whether it ends there, there are two very major and old manuscripts Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. And that's manuscript B and Aleph.
Mm-hmm.
And those two manuscripts, maybe, let's see here. I've got a pad here. Let me just, for the sake of the people here, I'll just put this up and hold it up to you. All right. So here, you can see, I don't know, can you see that?
I can.
Or doesn't
Yeah,
that show
when
up?
you're that close, you can. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. B, and then the Aleph is the Hebrew sign there. Now, those two manuscripts, and they end the book at 16:8. They do not have the long ending. All right. Now, these manuscripts are from the 4th century. The manuscripts that the King James used were all from the 12th century and later.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, I would be able to tell you they're Byzantine style manuscripts.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But they have this. Now, earliness is not necessarily determinative, but it is an important factor, so you can't discount that. But here's what I want to lay people today. Eusebius, who was a pretty prominent church father in the early 4th century, is, I think, determinative here, and I want to lay out for your people several issues. Number one, Eusebius was probably the top biblical scholar of his time, and he was chosen by the Emperor Constantine, who had, taken over the Roman Empire. You have the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 311, and so basically Christianity becomes possible. It's no longer illicit, it's a licit religion, it's legal. The Emperor Constantine asked that 50 copies of the Bible be put together for the churches of Constantinople, for the new churches that arrived. Now, these Bibles would contain the New Testament and the New Testament in the Greek translation and the New Testament books. He commissioned 50 of them and commissioned Eusebius to do the work. We have the documents on this. This is not just speculative.
Right.
All right. Now, it is highly likely that these two manuscripts, B and Aleph, were two of those 50.
Oh, wow. Okay.
That were commissioned by the Emperor Constantine. Okay? They do not contain the long ending. And Eusebius himself spoke about the issue of the ending in a letter to a guy named Marina. Marina. Now, in that letter, he says that the majority of manuscripts, and now listen to this, Brett, the majority of manuscripts, at any rate the accurate ones, end the gospel statement, for they were afraid. But he recognizes that other manuscripts go on and add more material.
Okay.
So in other words, he is aware of the two possible ways to end the book,
Right.
but says not only that the majority ended at 16:8,
But the
but that
best
at
ones.
any rate the accurate ones do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Now I want to add one more thing. Eusebius had a little system. You may recognize this or remember this. He had this system of cross-referencing called the Eusebian canons. And what the Eusebian canons were, I don't know, I'm going to hold this up real close. In by the spine, in the gutter here, you should be able to see these little numbers and so on right there.
Right.
Those are the Eusebian canons, which are Eusebius's cross-referencing system. So this was an early synopsis. So if you're in, let's say, if you're in Mark 6 at the feeding of the 5,000 and you want to know where it is in Matthew, you can use that little cross-referencing system to find it. All right. Here's my point. Eusebius put that cross-referencing system throughout all four Gospels, okay? But he didn't put it in the long ending.
Oh, okay.
He did not put it in the long ending. Why? Because he didn't think that that was
part of Mark.
Legitimate.
Yeah.
That it didn't think it was part of Mark. That's
Yeah.
exactly right. Now, I'm going to add one other point. This is the only place in the whole New Testament that I know of where the manuscripts themselves actually discuss the problem.
Oh,
Now,
you beat me to it. Yeah, I love this point. Yeah.
When I was at the seminary, I don't think that my professors talked about that actually.
Yeah.
That the actual manuscripts say that some go up to here and then others bring this. Well, so you know that there was this dispute in the early church about that, and
Right.
I think Eusebius actually settles the matter for us.
Right. No, and boy, that those are some very strong external evidence arguments.
Yeah.
For the ending in being verse 8.
Yeah, that's right.
Those are very compelling.
Now, let me talk a little bit about the Greek in the long ending. The Greek in the long ending is not consistent with Markan Greek. So, for example, you tend to have just a jumble of the features I was talking about, the kais and the des and the explicit subjects and so on. So it's clearly not doing the kind of thing that Mark was doing.
Right.
I want to point out one very small thing that you can maybe discuss with your people. Would you turn to the long ending?
Sure.
Because now, do you have a translation at hand, like an NIV
I do.
or something? Yeah. Right. What version do you have?
ESV.
The ESV. Okay, good. Now, here, I want you to take a look. So open that to 9 to 20, and then open your Greek New Testament.
Okay.
Now, I want you to look at the beginning, 9 through 11. Now, in verse 9, it talks about Mary Magdalene, okay? Then in verse 10, it starts out with the demonstrative pronoun ekine.
Okay.
That one, that woman.
Yeah.
Okay, so that woman went, upon going, announced to those who had been with him, all right?
Yes.
Now verse 11, kakainoi. And those guys, upon hearing that he was alive. Now, I want you here. This is a sophisticated point, but it's a really huge point. that use of the demonstrative pronoun ekine, and ekinoi as a subject, all by
Right.
itself, as a subject, never appears anywhere else in the Gospel of Mark, and in the long ending, it occurs 4 or 5 times.
No kidding.
Now, it's a small little thing that most people wouldn't think is important, but it is.
Right.
I want you to look at your translation now, because I'll bet you your translation just says she and they.
Yeah, she and they. Versus
Right.
that one referring to the woman, a feminine, and those
and
guys or those ones.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. See, so you would think that there is no demonstrative pronoun there when you read the translation.
Yeah.
So now here, and for the people who are watching this, let me give you a contemporary example. That of using a demonstrative pronoun as a subject is like a facial tic. It's a kind of characteristic of writing. Most people don't do that, okay? Mark doesn't do it. Matthew doesn't do it. Luke doesn't do it. You know who does it? John. John writes like that. So you all of a sudden start to have Johannine characteristics. Now, here is my contemporary example. You know that many people, especially younger people today, use the adjective like when they speak. Well, I was like talking to my folks, and like they said to me, hey, like, should we go there? All right. That's a linguistic tic. I don't ever do that. I don't ever use like, let's go. Hey, Judy, like, why don't we take the dog? All right. You have a teenage girl. She's very, very susceptible to that kind of linguistic thing.
Yes.
Well, now, what would you think if you saw a transcript of me speaking, and at one point suddenly I started to say, hey, like Brent, why don't we like do that? And you're thinking, what's going on there? Yeah. That's not typical. Right. I wonder if that transcript is a transcript of somebody else. See? Right. So that's the kind of thing I would say. There are these linguistic features in the long ending that are non-Markan.
Right. And then to top it all off, the short ending makes sense because of what Mark is doing literarily. And can you talk about that?
Oh, see, now this is your best question yet. Of course, this is really the key thing. And in preparation for this today, I made a couple of notes for myself, just hoping that this would come up. That essentially, most people think that, like Joel Marcus and his good commentary, his 2-volume commentary, it's a good commentary. But he and most people think that Mark is essentially about walking in the way of the cross, following Jesus.
Right.
I'm not here to deny that that is a theme.
Right.
But it is not the theme of Mark.
Yeah, so the argument would be that take up your cross and follow me. That's kind of the thesis statement of the gospel.
Right. And for that middle part of the gospel, it's a pretty big theme. But that's not the main thing. The main thing has to do with seeing and believing. Yeah. Whether or not you can trust Jesus's word, his promises. He gives 3 passion and resurrection predictions: 8:31, 9:31, 10:33, and 4. Okay? He says that when they enter Jerusalem, they'll find a donkey tied, and it's so. He says to prepare the Passover, a man will come carrying a jar of water, and it is so. He says to the disciples that they will all forsake him, and it's so. He tells Peter that he'll deny him 3 times, and it is so. And Brent, he says, after I am going before you into Galilee. Okay? Yeah. So we get to the end, and now comes the most important verse, 16. The young man says, he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him.
Just as he told you.
As he told you.
Yeah.
And that's what the gospel is about. It is about believing the sure word of Jesus. And this is why it's so incredible at the foot of the cross, when the Jewish leaders are mocking him.
Yeah.
And they say, the Christ, the King of Israel, let him come down now from the cross. Hina idomen kai pistoisomen, in order that we may see
him and believe. Yeah.
And he won't come down. Why? Because seeing is not believing. Believing is believing.
Yeah.
You know, in the Gospel of Mark, you don't see and believe. You first believe and then you see.
Right.
And so when the young man at the tomb says, he is going before you into Galilee, there you will see him just as he told you. Well, you have to believe that word, and if you don't go to Galilee, you're not going to see him. Right. So you have to believe him in order to see. Now, if I could please, let me just, to kind of do a capstone on that, let me just read here from the introduction to the commentary on just this point. And this is on page 61, the bottom paragraph here. So this understanding of the message is appropriate for all recipients of this book who may be thinking along these lines. We want to be confessors of the faith. We want to be faithful followers in the way. We are not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. But it would be so much easier to endure if we could see some proof or sign, if only we had been there when Jesus walked the earth. If only we had been there on that Easter morn, it would be so much easier to endure. And then I say, but the answer of the gospel is this: it was ever thus. If you had been there, it would not have been any easier than it is today. The evidence would have been ambiguous, even with your Lord. What you have is what the disciples and the women had also on Easter morning. You have the promise of his word, a word that is ever sure. Brent, this is the most Lutheran of all of the Gospels, because you've got to trust the word. You know, this is interesting. Luther made a mistake here. He thought John was the best gospel.
Yeah.
He should have realized that it is actually the Gospel of Mark.
Yeah. Speaking of John, though, I've heard you make this point that in a strange way, John and Mark lead you to see the same Christ, but from different directions.
But from different directions, right. Well, and look, you know, we just had this in the last couple of weeks. The doubting Thomas thing, you know, where Jesus says, do you believe because you have seen? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. They're working, Brent, they're working the same theme. And the theme is seeing and believing. Right. So, but they work it here. Instead of saying from different directions this way, I say from this way.
Yeah.
So Mark comes up from below. Jesus is extremely human.
Yeah.
He doesn't know touched his garment with the woman with the issue of blood, you know. He gets mad at his disciples all the time. So you get this impression, wow, this guy really is like a regular guy.
Yeah.
In John, it's coming down from above. Jesus is openly proclaiming the Messiah, I am he, and so on like that. So,
Right.
so these two gospels, though, are working the same idea from opposite sides, because one of them is showing you that the word is, the promise is sure. John is taking off the mask and showing you what it is that you ought to be believing.
Right.
This is why I believe both of those gospels were written after Matthew and Luke.
Yeah.
So Clement of Alexandria, about 150 AD, says that the two gospels with the genealogies were written first.
Right.
Matthew and Luke, one for the Gentiles, one for the Jews, one for the Gentiles. Then he says, comes Mark and John. Well, I think they are, so to speak, I don't know, how would you say this? They're like commentaries on the straight story. See,
Right.
I mean, they're different. They're more dramatic takes on the basic story.
Right. Yeah. And you put it this way, I think, in your commentary, that you've got to have the greatest story ever told before you can have Jesus Christ Superstar.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so you've got this
exactly.
great story in Matthew and Luke, and now Mark and John are going to be more artistic with it, emphasize things and take for granted some details that their readership already is aware of, either through Matthew or Luke or through the oral preaching of the gospel by then.
See, exactly. Either through that or the oral preaching of the gospel. And so, for example, you know that Mark is assuming other things.
Yeah.
Because already after Jesus's baptism and wilderness, it's all of a sudden it says, right out of the blue, after John had been handed over, Jesus went away into Galilee. Well,
Right.
What's with that?
Yeah.
I mean,
that just assumes you know that John had been arrested. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So, no, you've expressed this perfectly, that it, like, for example, he doesn't have a description of the temptations in the 40 days. I think this is all kind of around, people sort of know what you're talking about there.
Yeah.
Right. And so the business of, somebody saying this, well, if you don't go past 16:8, you don't have any proof of the resurrection. Well, what are you talking about? I mean, you're giving it to people who are already believers. They know about the resurrection. It's not like this is some great surprise.
Yeah.
And so, of course, you have proof of the resurrection. And the proof is just as he told you.
And I love you mentioned kind of reader response theory coming into vogue about the time you became interested in Mark. And what an ending for the reader having to now respond to what has just been read. Because what applies to the disciples now applies to you, the hearer of the Gospel of Mark. Eternally speaking, to see Jesus, we must first believe him.
Yeah, and this is a point that the reader response people started to make. So, in other words, this is one of the reasons why Mark became popular with the literary people, because it was, I don't know, what would you say here? There's just all this cool literary stuff going on, as opposed to Luke just sort of talking about the stuff.
Right.
By the way, I just wanted to tell you this, as far as the ending is concerned, is about a year or two ago, I told my wife, I said, if I die before you, this is what I want on my tombstone, okay? dot, dot, dot. Just as he told you.
Oh, that's great.
Mark 16:7. And so you want everybody who sees that's going to go look it up. There you will see him just as he told you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's a pretty good gravestone. Pretty good epitaph. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, it beats the W.C. Fields one. All things considered, I'd rather be in Philadelphia. Yeah.
I think Martin Short once said that he wants his gravestone to read almost. Well, we've got a little time left. I'd love for you to spend it sharing with us some of the wonderful things you do in the second volume regarding the crucifixion. Could you?
Yeah. You know, though, I was thinking about this last night, and if you'd like to do it, I was thinking maybe as a separate session we could do the whole thing.
Oh, I love it. I love it because it certainly warrants a longer treatment.
Oh, yeah, yeah. There's a whole bunch of things, and I hate to do it just as kind of a the verb you say that Jesus called out is a verb nobody pays attention to. The verb for his breathing his last, the tearing of the veil of the temple. People don't know what was on the veil, which is really important. So there's a bunch of stuff that I'd like people to, but here's what I thought that it might be valuable in our conversation. You guys said that you were coming to the Gergesene demoniac.
That's right. That's right. That's going to be the pericope after the next one I talk about. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm wrapping up 4, moving into 5.
Yeah. Let me maybe just say a few words about that. Okay.
Wonderful.
Okay. Now, first of all, Jesus takes this little foray across the Sea of Galilee to the Decapolis, which is the 10 Greek cities. All right. So at this point, he's outside of Israel.
Right.
Now, this is only what I would call a foretaste. This is proleptic Gentile mission. All right. So the real Gentile mission doesn't start until after chapter 7, when they have the discussion of clean and
unclean. Yeah.
And then he goes immediately after that to the Syrophoenician woman. See, so that's a different thing. And then that's chapter 7. Then at the beginning of chapter 8 is the feeding of the 4,000, which is also a Gentile feeding. So Jesus's real push beyond Israel is from 7 onward.
Right.
This is just dipping a toe in the water.
Yeah, a foretaste.
It's a foretaste, a prolepsis, right. Now, let's look at verse 2. At verse 2, it says, now, why don't you get down your ESV? Get down your ESV there.
All right.
And let's just kind of work with that. And I'd like you to read 5, verse 2.
And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit.
All right. Now, notice the translation. A man with an unclean spirit. But that's not what the Greek says.
Yeah.
It's a man in
an
unclean spirit. Okay? Now, this is, I think, a deliberate expression on the part of Mark. And if you are in an unclean spirit, that is the opposite as for a Christian being in Christ.
Right, right.
So, we are in the sphere of.
Yeah, under the
Christ,
influence of.
Under the influence of, in the sphere of, closely connected to, with this business of the unclean spirit. It's the reverse side of that.
Yeah.
So this is that part of the world that's against the reign and rule of God, as opposed to being allied with the reign and rule of God. Now, I want you to notice, please, would you go back to chapter 1, verse 23? And what do we have there?
Immediately there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit.
In an unclean spirit. It's the same thing, okay? Right. Now, where is that synagogue, Brent? In chapter 1. Right, that's in Israel. Now we have the same problem in Gentile countries. So Mark's pairing this up now, that the problem in Israel and the problem with the Gentiles are the same problem. Very subtly here, Mark is breaking down any wall between Jew and Gentile. Just like, for example, there is the great feeding of the Gentiles in chapter 8, paralleling the great feeding of the Jews in chapter 6.
Right.
I mean, people don't notice that is, people say, well, it's a doublet or something. Well, no, actually, he's in a different area of the Middle East at that point. Now, the point I want to make with your people here is, what is this business of calling it an unclean spirit as opposed to any spirit? Like this? Well, this goes back, and maybe you went over this with your people in chapter 1, and that is the parallel to Ezekiel 36. This is huge, and as far as I know, Brent, no other commentator on Mark has seen this parallel. In chapter 36, God says to his people that he will wash them and that he will put his spirit within them. Well, what happens in chapter 1 of Mark? John the Baptist comes and people. Then Jesus, he says, the one coming after me will baptize you with the Holy Spirit. Okay? So what does it mean now when people are described as in an unclean spirit? It means you're not washed, and meaning not under the reign and rule of God, which happens when you submit to John's baptism. John's baptism washes the people, making them ready for the coming of the reign, eschatological reign and rule of God, the reign and rule of God of the end times, which comes in its essence in Jesus. So it is extremely critical that you do not, like the NIV translates it, an evil spirit that
it's unclean.
Uses the unclean, right? And then that you, instead of saying in, you say with. So you are in the sphere of uncleanness, of not being ready for the reign and rule of God. And that is what was, the thing that made the guy unclean was not that he was among the tombs. The thing that made the guy unclean is he is under the influence of the spirits who are not under the reign and rule of God.
Yeah, right.
I mean, this is an absolutely huge point here, that the problem is, whose lordship are you under? Are you under the satanic lordship, or are you under the lordship of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ? So Mark sets this up very early on. It's so interesting how people seem to think that Mark's this action gospel and he's doing all these miracles. Everybody's got to realize that the essential problem, if you read Mark carefully, is the spiritual realm problem.
Right.
Jesus comes and announces in 1:14 that the reign and rule of God is at hand. The first thing is a man in an unclean spirit. He gets to chapter 2, he forgives a guy's sins, and they get mad about that. See, in other words, he doesn't just kind of go around and, heal a bunch of people and everything like that. That's all implementing the reign and rule of God. And the foundation of that is a right relationship with Jesus Christ.
Yeah, or
So
in 3, and the whole business about he being the one to bind the strong man.
Yes.
He might plunder his spoils. And now we've got the strength of this unclean spirit being emphasized. And what does Jesus do? He binds them.
See, exactly.
Yeah.
And what is it? The guy had chains, right?
Yeah, right.
He had chains.
Yeah.
And he broke the chains. They couldn't chain him. The guy is, completely under the control of the, what would you say, the powers of darkness or whatever. And Jesus basically frees people and plunders Satan's house in that sense.
He enacts what he says he's come to do in chapter 3.
Yeah, that's right. Now let me end my observations here to verse 19. So take a look at verse 19 at the end. And the guy asks about going along. Well, it goes to 18, all right? And as he was stepping into the boat, the demonized guy began to exhort him that he be with him. And he did not allow it. Okay, now why not? Why not? Well, the parallel here is in
establishing of the apostles.
Chapter 3, verse 14. That's exactly right. Is that when he gets the 12, the first thing it says in 14 is that they might be with him. All right? So Jesus has chosen the 12 to be with him to carry this on. At this point, Brent, the Gentiles can't fulfill that role. This is only a foretaste.
Right.
See, it's only a foretaste, and he's not able to be with him. By the way, that's the way I view seminary education. It's a number of years when you can be with him before you go out, because being with him is with the word, with the promises. You actually have that you have any kind of background, backing, foundation to do anything.
Right. And it's also, it applies even after we leave the seminary, that we pastors who are commissioned, called to proclaim and to teach, we have still to take the time to be with Jesus in the Word, or we've got nothing to give the people.
No, you have nothing to give. That's right.
Yeah.
You become a dry well. That's what people don't realize.
If you only exhale, you hyperventilate.
That's right. Well, very good. I will have to say that this is really, I've thought this for a long time. When people talk about the problem with preaching or with sermon ideas, actually, the problem is you're not in the Word enough.
Yeah.
Like, for example, look what we've just been talking about the last 10 minutes. You think there's not a sermon there somewhere? I mean, you don't have to be having sermon helps or something.
It's right under your nose. That's right.
It's right under your nose. That's exactly right. It's exactly right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Dr. Voelz, this has been a true delight, a thrill, really, and I know that my people are going to appreciate this as much as I have. Thank you so much for graciously giving us your time, and maybe soon we do this again and have
Yeah,
that discussion about the crucifixion and all
yeah,
those the special language Mark uses to describe his death on the cross.
yeah. I'd like to do just kind of a separate session on that. Right.
Sounds great. Oh, we
Yeah,
would love it. We would love it. Hey,
good,
God bless you.
good,
Stay safe and healthy, and give my love to Judy.
good. Hey, thank you so much. And this is just a great opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's been wonderful. Bye, Dr. Veltz.
Okay, bye.